The title of this lecture is The Hellenistic World, and we'll be looking at the time period 336 BC to 146 BC. Let's break down here, first of all, what these words and dates mean. The Hellenistic world. What does the word Hellenistic mean? Well, as we saw in our Chapter 3 lecture, the Greeks referred to themselves as the Hellenes, to their land as the Hellas. The word Hellenistic, then, means like the Greeks, or Greek-like. So what we see happen between 336 BC and 146 BC is that the known world, which specifically was Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Persian Empire, and Greece, all become Greek-like. Greece will spread its culture out through the known world and make the rest of the world Hellenistic, like the Greeks. The man responsible for that, as we'll see, is Alexander the Great. After the Peloponnesian Wars, which we talked about in our last series of lectures, Sparta and Athens, who had beat each other up from 431 to 404 BC, pledged peace and truce with each other. But they tried to outdo each other immediately following the end of the Peloponnesian Wars in allying with other polis and city-states throughout Greece. So essentially what you have to imagine here is almost like Sparta and Athens acting as very immature children, each trying to gather up and gang up as many friends against the other as possible. So in this environment, following the Peloponnesian War, in which Sparta and Athens were competing for allies, each wanting to have more allies than the other, this led to tense diplomatic relations between Sparta and Athens, and of course, the outbreak of war yet again. Many poli found themselves trapped in the middle, not wanting to decide between Athens or Sparta, wanting to be neutral and left alone. In this predicament, these city-states who wanted to remain neutral asked a Greek monarchy to the north by the name of Macedonia and its king, Philip II, to come to their aid and to intervene. In other words, these neutral states turned to Greek-speaking neighbors to the north who were separate from the Greek city-states, who were unified in a monarchy under Philip II. They asked these Macedonians to come to their aid, to intervene, to bring peace between Athens and Sparta, and to allow these neutral city-states to remain neutral. Many Greeks, however, thought this was not such a good idea to ask the Macedonians to get involved in Greek politics. One of these Greeks, who was very outspoken about asking for Macedonian intervention into Greek politics, was a famous Athenian orator and politician named Demosthenes. Demosthenes warned the neutral city-states of Greece against asking Philip II of Macedonia for help and aid and to intervene into Greek politics. In fact, Demosthenes warned the Greeks that what Philip II would want was not peace between Athens and Sparta, but all of Greece, and if invited to intervene in Greek politics, Philip II might become overly aggressive, overly ambitious, and desire to take over the whole of Greece. So Demosthenes sounds a warning bell against Philip II and Macedonia, begs and pleads with the Greeks, especially the Greeks of the neutral city-states, not to get Philip involved in Greek politics. But Demosthenes' warning came too late. Philip was definitely interested in conquering Greece. So when invited to intervene in Greek politics, Philip II saw an opportunity to conquer all of the Greek city-states. After all, the time was right for a conquest of Greece. These Greek city-states were weakened by 100-plus years of fighting, first against the Persians, then against each other. Philip II knew the time was right for Macedonian conquest of Greece. Demosthenes pleaded with the Greek city-states to go on the offensive rather than the defensive. In other words, he said, if Philip is coming for us, maybe we should do it on our own time schedule. We should have war when we're ready, not wait for Philip to come here and attack us. So Demosthenes was finally acknowledged. The Greeks finally listened to what he had to say. And in 338 BC, the Greeks met with the forces of Philip II of Macedonia at a famous and all-important battle called Chaeronea. Let me say here that Philip II of Macedonia reigned as the king of Macedonia from 359 BC until his death by assassination in 336 BC. For a brief period of about 2 years, he will also be the king of Greece. So I guess we can go ahead and kind of figure out how the battle between the Greeks and Macedonians will play out at Chaeronea in 338 BC. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, which lasted one brief day in the summer of 338 BC, the highly trained professional army of Macedonia met with the scattered force of Greeks at a place called Chaeronea. This battle was an absolute humiliating defeat for the Greeks who had assembled there. Most of the city-states in Greece had managed to put together some sort of force to send to Chaeronea to do battle with Philip II, but they were no match for Philip's superior army. Here at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip was aided by his son Alexander, and at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Greeks were defeated and forced into what was called the Common Peace or Corinthian League. In 338 BC, Philip II, by defeating the Greeks at Chaeronea, became the king not just of Macedonia, but the king of Greece. He forced the Greeks into what was called the Common Peace or Corinthian League. This was a unification of all of the Greek city-states. Philip brought together in the Common Peace and Corinthian League the Greek city-states. He unified all of them against their will. Of course, what this means is Philip II of Macedonia had done for the Greeks what they had never been able to do for themselves. As we've seen in our previous lectures, a Greek's loyalty was not to Greece, but to his or her individual city-state. Therefore, there was no unified Greek empire or one whole unified Greek civilization that all Greeks belonged to. Instead, they had been divided since their origins around 2000 BC into various groups and scattered settlements. By the 700s BC, Greece was made up of individual city-states. These city-states from the 700s BC until 338 BC had been independent, autonomous units that cooperated at times, but most of the time the city-states did not work together. So this unification was very unpopular among the Greeks. They did not want to be one solid group of Greeks. They certainly did not want to be one solid, unified group of Greeks under the leadership of the Macedonians. And this is sort of hard to understand and still to this day confuses historians. Why the Greeks disliked the Macedonians so much is just a really sort of strange thing. The Macedonians were Greek-speaking people and were ethnically Greek. And yet the Greeks of mainland Greece did not recognize commonalities with the Macedonians. The Greeks tended to view the Macedonians as barbaric and inferior to Greeks who lived in mainland Greece. This makes no sense whatsoever, but needless to say, Philip II was extremely unpopular. The Greeks did not like him at all. So when he was assassinated in 336 BC, on his way into a religious festival, the Greeks were somewhat relieved because that meant the end of Philip II. This also meant that their new Macedonian king, the new king of Greece, was a young man by the name of Alexander, not yet called the Great, whom the Greeks actually loved, respected, and admired. Alexander was Macedonian, but he had spent much of his youth in the school of Athens under the tutelage of the famous Greek philosopher and teacher Aristotle. So whereas the Greeks were apprehensive about being unified by Philip, they almost regarded Alexander as one of their own, and it was much more appealing to them to have Alexander as their leader than Philip II. Alexander was recognized by the Greeks for his brilliance. You may remember in a previous lecture I told you that the Greeks aspired to achieve perfection in body and mind, and the Greeks recognized in Alexander perfection of both. To the Greeks, Alexander was the ideal young man, very physically fit. At the tender age of 20, he was already experienced as a soldier, a veteran from the Battle of Chaeronea, a beautiful man, physically fit, and also extremely brilliant, highly intelligent. So, who is Alexander the Great? Where did he come from? What do we know about his early life before he inherited from his father both Macedonia and Greece? Alexander was born in 356 BC in Macedonia and would die in 323 BC over in Mesopotamia, somewhere around today, what would be the modern-day city of Baghdad, Iraq, or in his own lifetime, this would have been around Babylon and Mesopotamia. At the tender age of 32, he was not yet quite 33 when he died. One of the things that historians are just so fascinated with about Alexander is what he accomplishes in such a short life, what a lot he accomplishes by the age of 32. Alexander reigned as the king of Macedonia in 336 BC with the death of his father, and he also inherited from his father a vast Macedonian army and control over the Corinthian League of Greek city-states. By his death in 323 BC, Alexander reigned as the king of the known world. Alexander's early life centered around Macedonia. Alexander and his father had a very tense relationship, and some of this gets into the stuff of legend, of course, but I think it's worthwhile to share this with you. Alexander was born to Philip II and one of Philip II's many wives, a beautiful woman who was in fact not Macedonian at all, but her name was Olympia. And Olympia was not from Macedonia. She was actually from an area just outside of Macedonia called Ephesus. Olympias was chosen as the bride for Philip II because of her great beauty. Now, here I have to tell you that Philip II had a tendency to marry quite a bit. He was a very fickle man, never satisfied with one woman for too long. And what is really, really weird and unseen in Western civilization is that when Philip II tired of a wife, rather than banishing or exiling her or divorcing her, he just kept her around because he figured, well, he might want to quote-unquote revisit her at a later time. So just because he got a new wife didn't mean he was totally rid of the old one. He more or less kind of acquired for himself a harem of many wives. One of these wives was Olympias. And Olympias was a beautiful woman. This is why Philip picked her, for no other reason. Philip was completely and totally head over heels in love with Olympias when he first met her, and this was typical of his personality. When he first met a woman, he was all hot and heavy about her, and then his affections would tend to dwindle away and subside, but he was very much in love with her when he first saw her because of her great beauty. And he quickly got her pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. This son was named Alexander, and of course, he grows up to be Alexander the Great. Well, Alexander and his father had a very tense relationship, and here is some stuff of legend, and you just have to take it for what it's worth. Philip II grew tired of Alexander's mom and moved on to a Macedonian wife, and grew tired of the Macedonian wife and decided that he would revisit for the purpose of having a sexual relationship with Olympias. So he decided he would go back and he would revisit her, try to get a little bit of sexual affair going on with his previous wife, and so he pushed aside the Macedonian wife for a brief time period to go back to Olympias, Alexander's mother. As I told you, Philip has a complicated personal life. So, for some reason or the other, Philip wanted the element of excitement and surprise, I suppose, when he revisited Olympias, and so he came to her bedchamber unannounced and found her, supposedly, writhing in bed with a huge snake. And he thought this was a little bit perverse and weird, unusual, and it led him to question his wife. She's still his wife, she's just not his favorite one right now. He started to question her. You know, if she is capable of bringing a snake into her bed, what else might she have done? And so he almost begins to question the paternity of Alexander. He wonders, is my only son, Alexander is his only son at this time, is this only son of mine, Alexander, really truly mine? If Olympias is capable of taking a snake into her bed, what else might she be capable of? Infidelity? Perhaps Alexander is not my son. And at that point, the relationship between Alexander and his father changed. To this point, Philip had doted on Alexander and treated him very well, but at this point, their relationship becomes very tense. It's almost like Philip really doesn't like his son anymore. And when you read biographies of Alexander, it's very sad. You know, it's sad to me when I read these biographies of Alexander, because what he wanted more than anything else in his life was for his father to show some sort of affection, love, and respect for him as his son, and also as a man. And that was something that he just did not get until the Battle of Chaeronea. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, when Philip defeated the Greeks, Alexander was right in there with his dad fighting, engaging in hand-to-hand combat against the Greeks. And at one point, Philip II turned to his son Alexander, and he said, "Son, ask for thyself a new kingdom, for what I give to thee is much too small." Now, if you understand what those words mean, this was the ultimate compliment for Alexander. And some say that he grew teary-eyed and emotional because what his dad is finally saying to him here at the Battle of Chaeronea is, "You're doing great, son. I'm proud of you. You're awesome. You're going to be something great someday. You're great right now." But, backing up, until the Battle of Chaeronea, Alexander and his dad had a very tense relationship. And it was because, as I said a moment ago, Philip questioned whether or not Alexander was actually his son. Now, I need to take a sidestep here and just give you a little bit of information so you understand this. The chief god among the Macedonians was Zeus. The Macedonians were Greek culturally also. They worshipped the Olympian gods. Zeus was the chief god of the Greeks and of the Macedonians. Zeus, according to Greek mythology, had a tendency to be almost like Philip II and dissatisfied with his wife. Zeus was married to a goddess named Hera, but she was not enough for him. Zeus had a particular liking for mortal women, according to Greek mythology. And from time to time, he would descend from the heavens, from Mount Olympus, and assume the form of some animal and have sexual relations with a mortal woman. There are stories of Zeus taking the form of various animals, including a swan. Okay, and you wonder, why is she saying this? You'll see in just a second, okay? I'll get to it in just a bit. So, Zeus was the most important god to the Macedonians and the Greeks, believed to be able to take various physical forms, possibly even a snake. Well, we'll come back to that in just a bit. Alexander grew up and was very, very brilliant and aware of his mental abilities. In other words, Alexander knew about himself that he was not only physically attractive and very fit, but that he was also very brilliant. You know, he had the best tutor his father could buy, and that was Aristotle. As the relationship between Philip and Alexander grew more and more tense, Philip packed Alexander off to school in Athens, more or less to just kind of get rid of him. And there, of course, Alexander was trained by one of the most brilliant men who ever lived, Aristotle. So Alexander was very smart, well-trained, a very philosophical, intellectual type guy, but also very physically active. However, there was one thing that Philip observed about his son that was bothersome to him. Now, this is just frankly speaking, okay? There's no judgment here whatsoever. In ancient Greece, as we saw in particular in Athens, homosexuality was quite common with no social stigma attached whatsoever. The same can be said of Macedonia. So while Philip II had all of these wives that he liked, he also had male lovers. He noticed in his son Alexander that Alexander seemed to have no interest in women whatsoever. This bothered Philip because he did not want his son to be totally homosexual. The Greek way of life was primarily a bisexual existence. And what he observed about his son also is that while he was very physically fit, active, very intellectual, he also had a tendency to be slightly effeminate. And this was something that bothered Philip greatly. So he actually, at great expense and trouble, purchased many beautiful young women and tried to get Alexander interested in women also. This never worked. As we'll see in a little bit, Alexander will marry, but his preference always was for men. This bothered Philip. Though Philip himself had male lovers, he was bisexual. So another thing that bothered Philip about his son Alexander was that he had a tendency when he was home from school on vacation in Macedonia to be a bit mouthy, to talk back to his dad. And one of the best examples of this is that while home on vacation once, Alexander was watching his father, Philip II, attempt to break in a new horse. This horse had a strange name. It's called Bucephalus. You don't have to worry about that. But the name of this horse was Bucephalus, and it was a beautiful specimen of a horse. Philip II wanted it for himself. He wanted it to be his horse, but he could not break the horse. He tried repeatedly to mount the horse, and he couldn't get on the back of the horse. The horse would kick him off, throw him off. These other generals in the Macedonian army who had broke thousands of horses were trying, and they had no success. And Alexander was observing his father and these older men attempt to break the horse Bucephalus, and it struck him as funny that they were having no success with it. So, standing over under this tree, Alexander started to heckle these men and giggle and laugh, and this was seen as totally disrespectful. And Philip thought about slapping Alexander to the ground for being so rude and disrespectful, but he thought, okay, well, I'll teach you a lesson. If you think you're so perfect and smart and great, you try to break the horse. And probably he thought, so what if you get killed? You're probably not even my kid anyway. So anyhow, he put Alexander on this horse. He says, okay, this is your job now. I'm putting you on this job. You break the horse. So Philip and his generals and friends stood around and watched the mouthy, disrespectful Mr. Know-it-all Alexander attempt to mount this horse. And they watched in terrific amazement as Alexander took the horse, led it right under the tree where Alexander had been standing just a few moments before, heckling everyone else, jumped onto the back of the horse, and rode it away. And he came back on the horse and said, more or less, see, told you so, told you I could do it. And the men were aghast, amazed, dumbfounded. How in the world could he do this? And so they asked him, Alexander, how did you break Bucephalus when we couldn't? And he said, well, what I observed is that the horse could see himself, could see his shadow there, and as you all mounted his back, he could see that his shadow did not look right, that he could see you on his back, and it made him nervous and scared because he wasn't supposed to look like that. So by leading him under the tree, in the shade where there was no shadow, I was able to get onto his back and ride him away. And the men thought, wow, what a smart guy. Apparently this is what an education with Aristotle could do for you. At this point, Alexander started to really notice that his father treated him with a bit of dislike and disdain, and he questioned his mother about it and said, and it's almost heartbreaking, but he had a heart-to-heart talk with his mom, and he asked her, he said, why is it that Dad doesn't like me? I've excelled in school and athletics, and I broke a horse, and I can do all of these great things, and yet it never seems to be enough. Why doesn't Dad like me? And what she told him, supposedly, is that his dad, Philip II, was not really his dad. She told him, the father that you think you know as your father is not actually your father. And so you might remember Philip II had been thinking this all along. And so Alexander was shocked. Mom, how could you do that? And what she said is, you have to know the whole story. And so she told him that he was not the son of Philip II. He was not the son of some mortal man. That Alexander was actually the son of Zeus. But she swore him to secrecy here. Now, this just brings back to mind, probably, those images of her writhing around in bed with the snake. Whatever you want to make of this is the stuff of legend, I'm sure. But she told Alexander that he was the son of Zeus, but swore him to secrecy, and told him that he should never tell anyone this. Now, of course, he did, obviously, or, I wouldn't be able to tell you. So she says, you've got to keep this a secret. And he said, well, does Dad know? Well, does Philip II know? And she says, well, I think he suspects. So at this point, Alexander got even cockier, more full of himself. So what if Dad doesn't like me? I'm the son of a god. That means I'm half mortal man, half god. I don't need his approval anyway. So he became a bit more arrogant, went back off to school, then had the opportunity, of course, to fight alongside his dad at the Battle of Chaeronea. Dad was assassinated, and Alexander became the king of Macedonia and Greece. But now, who assassinated Philip II, and how does all that play out? Well, Alexander and his father had talked and planned that they would invade the Persian Empire, since they had under their control Macedonia and Greece. Why not take the rest of the known world? That would be the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire at this point encompasses Egypt, Macedonia, and as far east over to the boundary of India. So he and his father planned to take over the Persian Empire. After all, as Greek people, they hated the Persians. The Persians were their enemies. Aristotle had taught Alexander all about the battles of Marathon and Salamis in history class, and so he had sort of been taught to hate Persia, and he was looking forward to conquering Persia alongside his dad, even though the two didn't get along well. Just before this military plan of action was to get underway and the Macedonians were going to leave and go conquer Persia, Alexander and his dad attended a banquet, a celebration. And the purpose of this celebration really was to celebrate this big undertaking of the Macedonian and Greek conquest of Persia. Just so you know this, the second reason for this celebration was that Philip had married yet again, and this was to a Macedonian wife, and I alluded to this earlier. So he married a Macedonian wife who quickly had become pregnant and had a son, and at this banquet, there's a celebration for the upcoming invasion of the Persian Empire. It's also a celebration of Philip's recent wedding and the birth of his son. And one of Philip's friends was next to Philip at this party. You have to imagine it was a very loud affair. There was a lot of drinking, music, and dancing. And sometimes, when people are drinking, they get even louder. And this guy who was a good friend of Philip II was a bit of a loudmouth even when he was sober, but he was positively loud when he had been drinking. So he leaned over to Philip, and I guess he imagined himself somewhat whispering or something, but he said to Philip, he said, "Aren't you glad you have a real son now?" And a hush fell across the party. Alexander heard this, and though he knew what his mother had told him, this still hurt. Essentially, he was being called illegitimate at a public gathering, and he looked to his father, and he thought his father, Philip II, would defend him at least in public, no matter what he thought about him privately. But Philip said nothing. He just kind of smirked and laughed a little. That upset Alexander tremendously. And he said to his father in front of this hushed crowd now, "Father, you have nothing to say about that. Are you going to defend me?" Philip's reaction is just hard to understand here. He stood up, grabbed his sword, and ran for Alexander. Almost like he's mad at Alexander for saying something about this incident rather than being angry at the man who made the insulting comment. But Philip was so incredibly intoxicated that this attempt to pull his sword and run towards Alexander fails miserably, and in his drunken stupor he stumbles a few steps and falls face down. Alexander smirked and said, "Well, isn't that interesting? Isn't that hilarious? The man who prepares to cross into Persia cannot even cross a room." And everyone laughed despite themselves. They knew that by laughing they would offend Philip, but it struck them as very funny what Alexander had said about his dad. He was going to cross to Persia, but he couldn't even cross the room because he was too drunk. Well, at that point, it was public knowledge, obviously, from this meeting, that there was something going on behind the scenes between Philip and Alexander. Some sort of tension, some sort of rivalry. Well, not long after, Philip was attending a religious festival and was stabbed to death as he was going into a religious festival inside Greece. The assassin was a young man, not much older than Alexander. And there's a whole lot of speculation as to what exactly happened here. I think most of us, based on the story that I've just shared with you, and most historians feel this way, that Alexander was behind the assassination of his father. That public humiliation was the last straw for Alexander, and he wanted his father gone so that he could be the king of Macedonia and Greece and possibly the king of Persia. So Alexander was probably behind the assassination, but he himself actually did not do it. The young man who was the assassin of Philip was a friend of Alexander's, but okay, more complication here. It's just like a big old soap opera. Was a former lover of Philip II. Philip II had recently tired of this young man and had replaced him with yet another young man. So this young man, of course, had some hurt feelings. He was a rejected lover of Philip II, and when Alexander asked him, "Don't you just hate him? I hate him too. He's treated me so badly. Me too." And they kind of connected in a hatred and feeling like they had been done wrong by Philip. Alexander put this young man up to the assassination, and he stabbed Philip II to death. Alexander then promptly had this young man killed, so that probably the young man did not have time enough to say that he had been encouraged to assassinate Philip II. So, how does Alexander become the king of Macedonia and Greece? Through patricide, or murder of the father, Philip II. So, at this point, Alexander has inherited from his father, Macedonia, Greece, a large military of hoplites. These are professional soldiers. They number about 30,000, believing himself to be a son of Zeus, related to the gods Achilles and Hercules. Alexander was a bit cocky and felt the time was right to go ahead with this invasion of Persia, and he gave the Greeks a choice. He said, "You have accepted me as one of your own, but now let's make it official. You have two choices here. You can either cooperate and join up with my forces, you can become a part of the Macedonian hoplites, or you can resist and be crushed. Most of the Greek city-states joined with Alexander. They appreciated his intellect, his beauty, that he was the total package, that he represented what they aspired for in their own lives. So most of the Greeks joined up with Alexander. Those city-states that refused to join up with him in the conquest of the known world, the conquest of the Persian Empire, were razed to the ground, burned to the ground, and this served as a very effective warning. Other Greek city-states who had thought about not cooperating with Alexander quickly changed their tune and joined up with Alexander. So Alexander secured Greece, or unified Greece, against a common enemy, but also threatened the city-states if they did not join him. So they did. Alexander turned his attention then in 336 BC towards what he called the Great Crusade, or a battle against the Persian Empire to conquer the known world, which would last until 324 BC. In a short period of time, from 336 BC to 324 BC, that's just 12 years. In 12 years, as a result of his great crusade, Alexander led a combined force of Macedonians and Greeks into battle against Thrace, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, the Persian Empire, and went as far east as India. Alexander's conquest took him through Thrace, down and around through Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. So he conquered Thrace, Turkey, turned south from there, went down through Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, crossed over into Egypt, which he conquered and was proclaimed a pharaoh there. He conquered one particular area in Egypt and named the city there for himself. That was Alexandria, Egypt, which would become famous after Alexander's death as a great center of learning and scholarly research in the ancient world, famed, of course, for its library. At this time, Alexander took an unnecessary trip across the desert of Egypt to an oasis where he met with the most renowned prophet and oracle at the time. This was a person who was extremely gifted and could answer any question. So he traveled across the desert and met with the prophet and asked the prophet the question which had plagued him his entire life, and that was who his father actually was. And the prophet apparently confirmed what Alexander's mother had told him. The prophet told him that he was the son of Zeus. At this point, Alexander's already overflowing confidence grew even more, and he came back across Egypt, headed up through Palestine, Syria, Jordan again, cut over into Mesopotamia, which he conquered, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that old civilization of Mesopotamia. He then headed into Iran, Persis, Gedrosia, and Bactria. In other words, the Persian Empire. And he conquered the Persian Empire, made it as far east as India. This was farther than anyone had ever gone before. This was the edge of the known world. And when Alexander and his men reached the Indus River, they were standing there on the banks thinking about this invasion of India, they saw assembled on the other side of the riverbank the Indian army, which was 3 times as big as their army. And they noted that in the army were elephants, which really just absolutely horrified the Greek and Macedonian hoplites, who had not seen elephants, didn't know what they were capable of, but they were frightened by their size and the roar of these elephants, or the trumpeting, we should say, of the elephants, their loud, thundering feet, and they were horrified by it. At this point, you have to think that Alexander and his men have been gone from home, from Macedonia and Greece, since 336 BC. This is 324 BC, when they're on the verge of attacking India. They've been gone away from home from 12 years. Here, on the very edges of the Persian Empire, contemplating an invasion of India, Alexander is besieged by his men, who he knew supposedly all by name. All 30,000 of them he could call by name, supposedly. These men had been loyal to him, had fought for him throughout the ancient world, conquering the known world. They had been gone away from home from 12 years. They were exhausted, tired, and afraid. They were afraid that they were going to die in these places that meant nothing to them, far away from their homes, from their wives and children. Many of them longed to return home. They were homesick. Many of them were also afraid that they were reaching the ends of the earth, and they didn't know what lay ahead of them. Perhaps it was an area occupied by beasts and monsters, and they were afraid. They didn't want to go any further, and they pleaded with Alexander at a banquet before they were to go into battle to please stop, to turn around and go home, to end the conquest, that surely he must be satisfied. He was king of Macedonia and Greece, Pharaoh of Egypt, and king of the Persian Empire. Surely he must be satisfied. There was another reason for this change in Alexander's men and their unwillingness to go any further, and that was because of a change in Alexander himself. Alexander had told these hoplites, these Macedonians and Greeks, when they left home, that the enemy was the Persian. But as Alexander conquered these various areas of the Persian Empire, he allowed Persians to join his army. And Greeks and Macedonians were horrified as they saw many of these Persians promoted to important positions in the army over the Greeks and the Macedonians who had been with Alexander since the start and who were his people. They were also somewhat disgusted by the way Alexander was acting towards the Persians. He allowed the Persians to greet and address him by kissing him. This was not something that was done as a way of greeting in Greece or Macedonia. And it sort of made the Greeks and Macedonians angry. They felt disgust that he would allow himself to be kissed by a Persian. Certainly, letting them in the army and promoting them was bad enough, to be kissed by them and to start adopting some of their mannerisms and style of dress. This was just too much for them. It was a bit offensive. And what they pointed out to Alexander is that they had never been permitted to kiss him, and they found all of this just a bit offensive. So they asked and pleaded, could they please go home? And Alexander made the fateful decision that his conquest was over. Instead of fighting the people of India on their elephants, he gave the orders to turn around and head for Macedonia and Greece, so that his men who had fought with him for 12 years could make it back to their homelands. Essentially, at the edge of the Persian Empire, on the boundary with India, Alexander faced mutiny for the various reasons that I just discussed with you. So, as Alexander turned for home, he felt somewhat pleased with himself, but also a bit disappointed that he didn't go farther. What his whole idea had been was to conquer Persia and bring about a true marriage of East and West. By that he meant spread the culture of the West, of Greece and Macedonia, into the east of the Persian Empire, Egypt and Mesopotamia, to make the Persian Empire a part of Greece and Macedonia, to Hellenize those areas and give them Greek culture. He envisioned creating a brotherhood of man in which all people in the known world were connected by one ruler, himself, and one law, the laws that he made. In order to achieve this marriage of East and West, Alexander literally required marriage of East and West. Even though many of his Macedonian and Greek soldiers were already married to Macedonian and Greek women, they were encouraged by Alexander to father children with Persian women. And the idea behind this is almost, to kind of intermix with the Persian people and at the same time bring them down so that they're not completely Persian. The Macedonian and Greek men in his army who were single soldiers were made to marry Persian women and to stay behind throughout various parts of the Persian Empire, which is now Alexander's empire, to give these people the Greek and Macedonian way of life, to stay behind and instruct the Persians in the superior Greek way of life and Greek culture. So to create this marriage of East and West, many Greek and Macedonian single soldiers were left behind to more or less colonize the Persian Empire and to give this Persian Empire, which now belongs to Alexander, a Greek way of life. What results from this is Hellenistic diffusion. Alexander's goal was to spread or diffuse Greek culture, the Hellenistic way of life, outside of Greece. This was his goal, and he achieved it to a degree, but what more or less happened was a blending between the East and West. What he created was not a Greek and Macedonian complete cultural takeover of the old Persian Empire, but more of a blending of those two ways of life so that there was something completely new that emerged in this period. Some of the things that I'll just point out to you is that most of the people living in the old Persian Empire realized the superiority of Greek culture, and so they were somewhat willing converts to this new way of life. The only group, however, that refused to take Greek culture wholesale, that means to adopt every aspect of it, were the Hebrews who lived in Palestine. When Alexander marched through Palestine in the name of conquest, he allowed the Hebrews to stay true to their religious beliefs. Of course, we know about the Hebrews from chapter 2. These were the Jews. He allowed them to stay true to their beliefs, practice monotheism, and he allowed them to form their own independent organizations, independent of the rest of the Hellenized world, called politemas. The Hebrews lived in Hebrew neighborhoods with their own laws and political systems. The only thing that we can say really that the Hebrews took from the Greeks were the use of tombstones as grave markers and the adoption of the Greek language. It is at this point that the Old Testament is translated from Hebrew into Greek so that it would have a wider audience. As Alexander and his men made their way back home, Alexander fell ill and died at the age of 32 in 323 BC in Babylon in the old empire of Mesopotamia. The cause of his death has been debated for many, many, many decades. Historians and medical doctors have gone back through the last accounts of Alexander's last days to try to piece together what may have been the cause of death, because 32 is very, very young. What caused his death at the prime of his life? It almost seems that when he gives up the idea of conquering more territory, he starts to wane and decline. The cause of his death remains a mystery, but there are various ideas which I want to share with you now. Some say that Alexander died from alcohol poisoning. What we know about Alexander is that he was a raging alcoholic. He was drunk more than he was sober. He may have died from overconsumption of alcohol poisoning. We know that he had a tendency to become very violent when he drank, very aggressive. He was a mean drunk. He once killed one of his very best friends from childhood over a young man that both Alexander and his friend were interested in acquiring as a lover. So, in a drunken rage, Alexander killed one of his best friends over a lover they had shared. The other idea is that he may have died from a wound suffered in battle, which had become infected, possibly gangrene. Dysentery is another suggestion, or malaria. There's some new evidence, and I mean like within the last 2 to 3 years, that has come out that some scholars and doctors say that Alexander died from an accidental drug overdose, that he had suffered from sort of like anxiety and depression, and he was given various herbal concoctions to help with his anxiety and depression. And some speculate that he may have been given the wrong combination of herbs or too much, not intentionally by his doctors, but that they over-medicated him and caused his death. Whatever the cause, it was a great loss for Alexander's men. In his honor, they carried his body to Egypt, where it was mummified as a pharaoh and placed inside a crystal casket. That casket went missing, and no one knows where Alexander's remains are today. When Alexander was in his last minutes on this earth, one of his trusted generals and commanders leaned into Alexander and asked the question that everyone wanted answered, and that was, to whom do you leave your empire? Remember now, this is the largest empire we've seen to date because it includes everything we've talked about this term so far. It includes Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Persian Empire, Macedonia, and Greece. So the general leans in to Alexander and he asks of his friend, a man that he had given 12 years of his life to, he leans in and he asks Alexander, to whom do you leave your empire? And Alexander's dying words were, to the best man. Of course, this is a vague and troubling statement. Who's the best man? Who is the one who should have this empire? Well, it may seem obvious that it should go to Alexander's heir, because Alexander practiced what he preached. He himself had married a Persian woman by the name of Roxanne, a princess, and had a son with her. The son was a baby, though, and so if the child could not rule, this responsibility would fall to a Persian princess or to some advisor, and this was not something that Alexander's generals could stand. When Alexander died, he had 4 best friends, we'll just say, 4 really good friends who had been with him and served him throughout his period of conquest. These 4 men were his 4 commanding generals in Alexander's army. So these 4 men figured that the statement, to the best man, meant one of them, but this is open for interpretation. Is it me? Is it you? Is it him? Who is it? But they all agreed the first thing they had to do was to get rid of any heir to Alexander. So Alexander's 4 best friends and generals in his army hunted down Roxanne and the infant son and killed both of them so that there would be no heir or direct tie to Alexander. These 4 men then turned on each other and fought for 40 years to gain control over Alexander's empire. In 40 years of fighting, none of these 4 generals was strong enough to take over the whole of Alexander's empire. So by the end of 40 years of fighting, these 4 generals and 4 great friends of Alexander came to the conclusion that none of them was the best man. What they agreed to after 40 years of fighting was to divide Alexander's empire into 4 parts, one for each man. So, Antigonus Gonatas formed in Macedonia what is called the Antigonid dynasty. He was able to conquer the area of Macedonia and keep it for himself. Ptolemy, on the other hand, a general and former friend of Alexander, founded the Ptolemaic monarchy in Egypt, and he established a dynasty there that would last for many generations. One of the most famous rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty actually is Queen Cleopatra VII. That's the famous Cleopatra that you've heard of before. You probably just didn't know there were 6 who ruled before her, and you probably thought she was Egyptian. In fact, she is a descendant of this Macedonian general Ptolemy who served Alexander the Great. So Ptolemy takes Egypt. The other guy that we need to briefly mention here, who takes a part of Alexander's empire, is Seleucus. Seleucus takes a large area of territory. Seleucus takes from southern Anatolia or Turkey all the way over through Persis or modern-day Iran. This is called the Seleucid monarchy. The last remaining part goes to Eumenes, and this is northern Anatolia or just northern Turkey, and that area came to be known as the Pergamene monarchy. So, to the best man was a vague statement that led to warfare lasting 40 years and the 4-way division of Alexander the Great's empire. In just 12 years, Alexander conquered the known world before succumbing to some mysterious illness which killed him at the age of 32. None of his generals and friends was strong enough to hold the whole empire. It was divided 4 ways. This ends our discussion of chapter 4.